Hello and welcome to Right Specialty's webinar on managing community use of facilities and student travel. I'm your host, Justine Del Prete. I would like to introduce today's speakers. We have Bob Bambino, Senior Vice President of Right Risk Management, along with Andrew Graham, the Vice President of Right Risk Management. Participants, you may ask questions at any time by using the chat feature. Let's begin.
Well, thank you, everyone, for joining with us today. These are the topics that we're going to be discussing today. If there are any others that you would like covered, please use the chat feature with the topic and we'll cover it. We chose these topics because they seem to constantly be on our clients' minds throughout the entire year. There appears to be no shortage of groups and individuals looking to use school and college facilities for a number of different reasons. For example, sports, general meetings, conferences, tournaments. We covered summer camps and special events usage in our prior webinar. If you missed it, it'll be up on our website probably within a week. Regarding student travel, it seems that only budgets and perhaps sinister events occurring in our society that slow down student travel. Clients took a harder look at student travel after 9/11/01, at the start of the military actions in Iraq and Afghanistan, and after large terrorist events that occurred overseas. If not, it seems to be a pretty gradual flow. So, dealing with community use of facilities. This is an outline of the exposures and the risks that we see. This is the continuum. The more usage that you have increases the likelihood of accidents, and accidents produce fertile environment for claims and litigations. The accidents that we see that arise out of community use of facilities usually arise from the activity that's involved, such as baseball, softball, football, lacrosse, a meeting, tournaments, playoffs. And the people that are most likely to be injured are the participants, the referees or umpires, and then to a lesser degree the people who are spectators just watching the game. Typical allegations that are made when there are claims or litigation initiated involve failure to maintain or manage facilities, warn of hazards, provide adequate equipment, and then respond to notices of defects. Now, one way, or probably the best way, that an educational institution can reduce the severity of an accident that occurs is through some type of contractual risk transfer. Now, contractual risk transfers are not going to prevent the accidents from occurring. They just reduce the severity or the amount of money that's ultimately paid out by a company like Right Specialty. And as you all know, when any insurance policy is up for renewal, the underwriters take a hard look at the loss experience. And just like with the personal auto policy, the more loss experience you have, the less happy the underwriter is about the account. It could result in things like increased premium, maybe large deductibles, or maybe some restrictions on coverage. Who should provide insurance coverage when they're using your facility? Well, it seems that educational institutions vary in the way they enforce this rule. If you have a policy, such as a board policy, where all facility users must provide proof of insurance, then it needs to be enforced. If not, and if it's done more informally, it's usually asked for groups that have the coverage in place, such as regional or local soccer or some type of athletic leagues or teams, Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, public schools, other colleges, and private schools. Or the other way to look would be to mandate any organization that's doing an activity on your property that presents you with risk. And that would certainly be, again, anyone in sports and athletics, recreation, or a group that will be using your facilities frequently. Let's say the Scouts that are meeting once or twice a week.
The main issue with risk transfer is that when the facility user is coming in and using your facilities, the main thing to remember, it's their responsibility. Now, when you do the risk transfer the correct way, from an insurance standpoint, from a legal standpoint, it's as if they own that property and have the responsibility for that property if you do the risk transfer correctly. So that's how you want to think of this. Anybody that is coming in and using your facilities, it's like it's their facility, and their losses and their time there is their responsibility. That's what you want to get to.
So how do you get there? How do you put in place a good contractual risk transfer? Not all that difficult. First step is the facility user, whoever they may be, applies for your permit, whether online, in hard copy, or in person. The permit is granted if the user meets all the requirements. Now, most public K-12 schools have some restrictions on who can use their facilities and for what reasons. So if they don't match up there, obviously the permit's not going to be granted. A permit should also include your rules, or what you're requiring or what you're prohibiting from facility users. So, for example, it might include things like what happens if there's damage to the equipment, prohibitions against alcohol, in most cases, tobacco, illegal drugs, what happens if there is not a custodian available, how to notify someone in the event of an accident, and then how to report hazards or dangerous conditions that the facility user might find. The facility user then provides liability insurance, and they certainly want to list your educational institution as an additional insured. Our recommended coverages for facility users, and these are just really recommendations. It seems that everyone sort of follows this, but people really do it differently depending on their local policy or circumstances. You would want a commercial general liability policy. You'd want liability limits of at least $1 million each occurrence and $2 million in the aggregate. You'd want a declination that coverage exists for athletic participants. You'd want the school or college listed as an additional insured. Now, let's just back up for a second. The reason we want an affirmative statement regarding coverage for athletic participants is many times when, let's say, local youth or even adult leagues or teams are looking to use facilities, when they go out and purchase an insurance policy, if the liability coverage is quoted with coverage for athletic participants, tends to be higher. It's what they need, and that's really coverage for the people that are participating in the event, like the team members. If they're looking to reduce the premium, then they can purchase a liability policy that excludes coverage to athletic participants. Doesn't occur that often, but maybe in 20 or 25% of the times that this issue comes up, we find that it's not covered. In that instance, the only people that are really covered would be the spectators, and possibly maybe the umpires and referees. Not very, very good coverage, and not really very good coverage for you. If you have tournaments going, if you're letting local public high school leagues use your fields consistently, well, you might want to consider a commercial excess policy. An excess policy would provide higher limits. So, for example, if you're going to be giving your fields out for, let's say, 4th of July holiday, maybe if you did it for Memorial Day weekend, or maybe for a period of time during the summer, if you're going to have 1,000 or so people playing on the fields over the course of 2 or 3 days, you might ask for an excess policy with limits of $1 or $2 million, and that'll push the limits up higher and will ultimately give you more protection. When a risk transfer is done correctly, as Andrew said, the facility user or the outside group bears the financial impact of a claim or lawsuit. The user or the group, or most likely their insurance company, their liability insurance company, will provide a defense, meaning they'll appoint attorneys and investigators, and indemnification, meaning that if there's a settlement in order, it'll come out of that fund and not yours, and this will be for the benefit of your institution. And as I said before, if this happens, the loss does not show up on your loss experience as a claim.
I'd like to take a question from one of our participants, Mike Chuck. He is asking if we could share a mock-up of correctly completed COI with all coverages and wording reflected.
It's on the, I believe we have an example of that on the website. We have our standard specs that we put out there, and those should be up on the website. I don't think we have a mock certificate of insurance, but we can definitely get that to you.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question.
Yeah.
Well, we can do one of two things. When if you give us a day or so, what we'll do is we'll give Justine our sample insurance requirements. We'll also give Justine a copy of our sample use of facilities form, which certainly has to be adopted and changed for your own situation, but we'll give you that as well. And then what we'll do is we'll try to take a certificate of insurance and put it together so it kind of resembles what you should be getting from the public. But that's a great question.
And again, you will be able to print, the presentation will be sent to everybody, as well as the recorded webinar, which is always hosted on our website because we do these monthly, and they're all hosted, and the presentation gets sent around throughout, after the webinar is over, it gets sent in an email to everyone, so you'll all have a copy that you'll be able to print out.
And just to follow up what Bob was talking about with the risk transfer and the coverages and the limits that you're supposed to have, the coverages in place when you're going to the facility user, those just show that they have coverage, right, which is the main thing. So if something happens, they have coverage. If they didn't have coverage, then it would go right to you because there's nobody else, right? That's what you want to check. But the next thing after that, which Bob again mentioned, is the additional insured status, and that is the most important part of the whole shebang is the additional insured status, because that's what makes it a direct route if there's an accident to them, not to you as the owner. So that's what you want to make sure that you have very clear, that it's very clearly stated on a certificate, but that you make sure that you either have an endorsement that doesn't have a lot of exclusions, or that it's part of the policy, the additional insured status is part of the policy. And that's why it's very important that when you collect that information, that you collect the additional insured endorsement or the part of the policy so it can be reviewed either by your broker or by us or by your legal to make sure that you're not excluded.
Okay, so what can you do from a risk control perspective to reduce the number of accidents that might occur? Good idea to periodically inspect facilities that are used by outside groups. If the facility is not suitable for the anticipated use, then what you're going to need to do is either restrict it, shut it down, close it down, maybe mark it off, tape it off. You don't want to have people using a field or a court or a building or a dormitory that has some issues, has some defects, and is really not suitable for public use. You can rest assured that if you don't have immunity for this and there is litigation, one of the questions asked will be, were you aware of this condition that existed that allegedly caused damage to the plaintiff? And if the answer is yes, I did, or if it's developed during a deposition that you should have known that, that's not a good situation to be in. If you're notified of a defect or a hazard, quickly respond to that. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to do repairs. It could be something that's really not an issue. It could be something that could be fixed quickly, but you want to have a record showing that you were notified, you responded, and you took a reasonably prudent action for it. As I had mentioned before, it's a great idea to allow your usual or your frequent facility users to give them an opportunity to report hazards and defects over to the school or the college. Now, there's a downside to that. We've all had experience with groups that are going to report everything. Grass is too long, grass isn't green enough, trees need to be trimmed, goalposts don't look good enough. But certainly if someone has a legitimate complaint, you want to be able to put them in a position where they could notify the right person as quickly as possible. When you look at it, outside groups really need to know how to report hazardous or dangerous conditions to your institution. The best thing to do is to give them one name, one email, one phone number so they can contact one person directly. This way they're not reporting it, let's say, to the Buildings and Grounds Department. They're not reporting to the business office. They're not reporting to, say, the provost or the headmaster. They're giving it to one individual who can then take a look at the complaint and decide what type of action that they need. Looking at fields, particularly, let's say, fields or courts that are not necessarily used very often by you, but they are used by the community, it's always a good idea to look at it before the season. After regular use, such as if it's primarily weekend use, you'd want to take a look at this on Monday morning. And if there is a tournament or there's playoffs or there's a large event or a very, very busy period of time, it wouldn't be a terrible idea to have somebody from Buildings and Grounds on site during the day or during the usage.
Yeah, I just had an experience with just such an issue about 2 weeks ago where one of our educational clients uses their baseball field for community use, and they did a tour luckily before the use, and they found 3 large holes in the outfield that had to be filled. And so, we were talking about risk transfer before. The facility user can have all the risk transfer documentation and the coverages, but if there's a problem with the field or the building or the floors or the lighting with where they're using it, then that can come back to you as as if you were using somebody else's facility, you would want it to be in good shape as well. So just make sure, like what Bob said, if you're going to have community use, on a regular basis, make sure before that community use happens that you have somebody go through it and around to make sure that it's all in good condition.
Now, one of the problems with the risk transfer process is this. There can be great political pressure or community pressure on an educational institution to waive insurance requirements, to lower them, to not ask for them. That's why having a policy that's enacted properly, following the policy, and being able to show that policy to outside groups that want to use the facilities will help you. We get questions periodically, and they're very, very difficult questions to try to help our clients with, when they'll say something like, well, we do have a policy about facility uses, but this group is, and you could probably fill the blank in better than I can. They're related to a board member, they're friends with the superintendent, president, someone in administration, or their headmaster. They're a civic group. They're people that are politically connected. They're people that might be making donations to the school. They might be people that help with the budget. It could be somehow affiliated with a PTO or an alumni group. So if you have the policy and the policy has to be followed, it's usually a lot easier than it would be if you're just looking at these cases on a case-by-case basis. One other thing to think about, and a client told us this a while ago, if they have requirements for outside groups to use facilities and they cannot obtain the insurance, well, it could be a financial issue, could be a small group that doesn't really charge enough dues, or it could be an organization that has terrible loss experience, has no management control, has no policies and procedures on their own, and that might be the reason that the insurance industry is either refusing to give them coverage, will only offer them substandard policies, or is going to charge them such a large premium that they can't pass the cost along to members. So it's sort of a way of, I guess, unofficially underwriting or evaluating somebody who wants to use your facilities. Okay, now, on student travel. Travel in higher education is different than it is for the K-12 population. In higher education, the students are usually not minors. They can sign documents and waive rights. They can acknowledge things as adults. And the duty that is owed to them is generally less than it might be or would be for K-12 students. However, in higher education, the travel is usually more extensive. There are more overseas trips. There are more what we would consider to be fun but exotic travel. The travel is typically of a longer duration, and it involves more, let's say, adventurous activities or challenges as part of the trip and activities. When there are claims involving student travel, most of the injuries are from activities that are involved in a particular event, such as slips and falls, contact in sports, people tripping, let's say, as they're walking through a city, maybe somebody falling down as they're going on some type of a tour, being led by a tour guide. There are, thankfully, not that many assault claims. The ones that do occur are usually student on student. And while we've seen some claims involving allegations of sexual assault, they're typically rare, and usually they're between students and not unknown third parties. When you look at the litigation, the allegations typically include failure to supervise students, failure to enforce rules of conduct, not having enough trained chaperones, and a failure to warn about hazards. Some of the other issues that are involved are, more for the K-12 group, is the travel appropriate for the age level? How are you going to dispense medication to students that need to take medication on a daily basis or during an emergency? How's the transportation going to be handled? For example, if you're leaving from an airport, how are you getting to an airport? What's the travel going to be like in foreign countries? Is it public transportation, or are you going to be renting vehicles, buses, or vans? Are you going to allow parents to attend? Are you going to allow non-students students to attend? And then there's an issue that we'll talk about later on, and that involves the question of whether or not a trip is school-sponsored or it's not school-sponsored. It's not uncommon for us to get questions about, can the chaperone bring their children? Could we allow a couple of graduates to come? One of the students' chaperone has a boyfriend, girlfriend, friend at another institution that wants to come along. Again, these are difficult and maybe even present some reputational risk when you're evaluating each of those questions or inquiries individually. It's good to have a policy put together that either gives guidance, moves the decision further up the chain, or simply doesn't allow it.
The only thing I would add to that, and to what Bob said at this time, is that if you've been doing student travel and you have regular trips abroad or within the country and you do it on a regular basis, that's one thing. But if it's new to you, and we've come across this a couple of times where academies or colleges are just starting a new program to have kids travel, have students travel, I would just say take it slowly, because all of the things that you think that you've thought of, you probably haven't thought of. If you're going to get into it slowly and deal with the issues that come up as they come along.
Okay, now, the issue of school-sponsored or not is significant for this reason. If it's not sponsored by the school, then typically there's no insurance coverage for trip organizers such as teachers, coaches, or professors that are going along as chaperones or guides. Liability coverage and, in many states, protection under a public officers law only involves school-sponsored or educationally sponsored activities. So, if you're a soccer coach at a college and you're moonlighting someplace else in the evening, well, you're not going to get coverage under a liability policy, and you probably would not get coverage under a public officers law if it was a public college or university. If teachers get together, and this is common, and they plan an activity on their own, if it's not sponsored or endorsed by the educational institution, again, under a public officers law, protection may not flow, and under the liability policies, it's also unlikely. Now, coverage will usually always exist for the educational institution. So if teachers get together or professors get together and they plan a trip that's sort of offline, if there's an injury and there's an accident and there's litigation and the college or the school is brought into the lawsuit, in all likelihood that particular entity would be covered. But it becomes doubtful or questionable for teachers and staff who do these things out on their own without correct sponsorship or approval. The problem is that we find with our clients that it's hard to determine exactly what the policy or the procedure is to approve or to get something sponsored. So that's something good to look at. So what's some of the criteria to consider? Well, what's your board policy? Who approves travel? What's the criteria? Is there a document or form that needs to be completed on the website for that? Many times we find in K-12 environments, if it's a day trip where the students will be back in the afternoon, typically the principal can approve that. If it's anything more, such as overnight, or if it's travel overseas, it might have to be approved by, let's say, the headmaster, or perhaps even the board itself. So here are some of the deciding, or let's say confusing factors. No formal approval process. We'll look at the past practices and traditions. It's good to know who's organizing the trip. And then can the organizers use school property or supplies? One issue that we see that comes up frequently is travel that's sponsored by, let's say, an alumni group, a PTA, or a parent-teacher organization. If those groups are sponsoring the travel, well, it's sometimes questionable as to whether or not the educational institution has gone along with it.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a question from Mike Trochkick again. He wants to know if we have a sample policy that we can share.
Hello, Mike. No, we don't, unfortunately, but if anyone does that they'd like to share, even if you need to redact some stuff, just let us know, and then if we get that, we'll also send it out as well. So just some other ideas about whether or not an event is sponsored or approved is usually the questions that are going to be asked are, what's the relationship to curriculum or the grade level? Is there some, is it related to athletics? For example, is the baseball team going to go into down south, let's say during spring break, where they can practice, whereas, if they stay home, the weather's not really inviting? Does it emanate from a school-sponsored club? Has it been approved or permitted in the past? And then one kind of a dark or confusing area is what we would call legacy issues or legacy travel. And that's typically trips or student travel that has occurred historically, sometimes over a very long period of time, but without official approval and in some cases without the knowledge of administration. And I would imagine that that's a very, very difficult thing to look at and try to evaluate and maybe in some cases restrict.
I was just going to add one thing that we see a lot, that comes up a lot about evaluating student travel, and this is mainly for travel within the United States, where you see athletic teams, a lot of times, especially from the north, maybe heading down south for spring training or for some type of mini camp, where you'll rent a van or you'll rent some kind of vehicle to travel down with the team. We're seeing a lot of people trying to rent 15-passenger vans. That's an issue from a lot of standpoints, in that, A, 15-passenger vans do have a problem that's been proven, that they roll over. Most of you probably know this already. I know we do have something on the website about 15-passenger vans. But the other issue that comes up even more than that is who's driving the vans. Can students drive the vans? Again, this is, this can be high school, this could be college, could be either of the two, but it's a big issue that needs to be discussed before you start getting down into the nitty-gritty of the trip, is planning how you're going to get there and who's going to be driving, if you're going to be driving. And if you're going to be obviously renting a coach bus, which would be preferable, then we go back to the risk transfer part of it again and making sure that the bus has the right insurance information.
Okay. High-risk activities usually present some type of a challenge. Events like rafting, mountain hiking, rock climbing, skiing, cave exploration, use of zip lines, good things like that. If you're doing this, and typically, not typically, but in some cases, it's done by using let's say an outbound organization or an organization that will actually provide the activities. If you're doing that, you want to confirm that the group has the proper certifications, licenses, that the guides are properly qualified, the instructors, the outfitters, all carry whatever legal licenses or certifications they need to carry. I can't emphasize this enough. We'll talk about it in a couple of slides going further, but you have to put a detailed description of what the activities are, either in the parental permission form or the form that, let's say, a college student who's not a minor will complete on his or her own. It's a good idea, more for K-12, to provide an opt-out provision if it's available. So, for example, if you say something like students that do not want to go on the the whitewater trip from hell, they have an opportunity to go and do something else that doesn't involve that. You certainly want to enforce, mandate, and require the use of personal protective equipment as it's required or mandated or usual for the activity involved. In some cases, you might be telling students that they need to bring personal protective equipment with them along with the trip. If they're doing that, it's probably a good idea to check that before you leave. So if, let's say if everybody is meeting at the middle school where the buses are going to pick people up and take them out, or if the bus is picking up kids at a certain dormitory on a college, or if you're meeting at an airport, you might want to check and make sure they have the required personal protective equipment before they go. You don't want to be put in that position of refusing someone an activity that they've already paid for once you're on the trip. Another good idea is that for real specialized high-risk activities, you may actually mandate a particular brand or type of equipment. If that's the case, then you want to enforce that as well. Just a couple of minutes on emergency management planning. It's a good thing to have for any of us here that have been involved in these type of activities. Things happen. They could be as simple as somebody, just kind of getting hurt on a climb, or can be something more serious than that. If you have students that are vulnerable, that have a medical issue or vulnerability, then you want to be able to deal with that in some way. It's not a bad idea to ask that question also on the permission form. There are automobile accidents, cars break down, they're involved in accidents. If you're using your vehicle, good idea to have some policy in place where you can contact AAA or another organization where you can get help and get the bus going again. Hotel fires are hard, and if they do occur, not a bad idea. In anticipation of them possibly occurring, good idea maybe to get everybody together and say, listen, if you hear the fire alarm, we're leaving, we're going out, we're meeting in the parking lot. We're not staying in, we're not making a decision as to whether or not it's a real fire or not. Unfortunately, trips overseas, not so much domestically, you might be in an area where there is some civil unrest, maybe there's some type of political issue there. Not a terrible idea to have some plan in place where you speak to the hotel, the camp, wherever you might be going, the resort, and ask about their emergency management plan before they leave. And if they tell you they have a plan, ask them to share it with you. You can share it with the participants. It does happen, unfortunately, where students and in some cases staff are involved with the criminal justice system. They're arrested. You might want to think about how you would handle that. Certainly, you'd call back in to your school or college and let them know, but something to think about as well. And certainly, with weather emergencies, you're not going to go out and do whitewater rafting if they're predicting foul weather. You're not going to be doing mountain hiking or climbing in the same way. But the bigger concern is what happens if you are there and there isn't a weather emergency, such as hurricane, maybe some extreme cold weather, maybe some other type of event. How does the hotel, the resort, how does the camp handle that? And how are you going to handle that if you're out camping, let's say, in the outback?
It may not be a bad idea also. We're talking about planning for these things, just like we do with a lot of other subjects, to do a tabletop review where you get all the people that are responsible for that particular trip together, and you run through a couple of different scenarios that could possibly happen. Obviously, you're not going to hit every scenario, but go through the scenarios, and this will dictate, a lot of times dictate the plan, and more importantly, dictate the people that will have responsibility and communication responsibilities to map out so you're prepared in case it does happen.
Okay, some other things to think about. Not a good idea to be traveling or out if you're in violation of your school or college policy, so you want to check on travel restrictions. If there is mandated chaperone ratios, particularly on lower grades, you want to follow that. If transportation can only be done through, let's say, the transportation company that the school typically uses, that's something you want to do. If there's an approved list of coach companies that you need to use, you want to check on that as well. The other aspect of transportation is whether or not parents, teachers, or chaperones can drive their own vehicles to transport students. If that's the case, then you need to make sure that whatever the requirements are, they're being followed. For example, if you're going to allow a volunteer chaperone to drive students, that should be in the parental permission slip. You might want to look at the vehicle, make sure it's properly registered and inspected, and you might want to run the person's Department of Motor Vehicle record, if you can, to determine whether or not they are properly licensed. It's a good idea. You might want to think about cash handling. How's that done? And you want to take a look at your parental permission forms. If they haven't been looked at in the last year or two, good time to look at them. As I mentioned before, you want to list as much details about the event as you can do it. If you're using an outfitter or you're going to a camp or resort or to a hotel, good idea to refer the people to the website so they can get a better idea. If you've chosen an outfitter that's going to take you out and, let's say, do some canoeing, if they have a website and they explain what the programs are like, not a bad idea to say, we're using this particular outfitter and we're taking Plan B. We're going to be going 5 or 6 miles up and down the river or whatever you're doing. Explain transportation, and then certainly, particularly when you're dealing with K to 12, you want to talk about what is the housing like if you're going overnight, and what are the accommodations like. Chaperones are most of the times volunteers. They can also be paid staff in some situations. If they are volunteers, we strongly recommend that you have an application, have them complete it. If they give you references, check the references. In many states, if you're working with students, there needs to be a criminal background check, and if you're required to do that, you must. It's not a bad thing to do voluntarily as well. If you're going to conduct a criminal background check, if you're going to check references, which you should, it should be indicated in the application, such as if you're in a state that says anybody working with children under the age of whatever it might be, they have to have a criminal background check pursuant to whatever Department of Education regulation. Good idea to put that in there. The Code of Conduct is interesting. Many educational institutions consider any school-sponsored activity to be covered by the Code of Conduct. So if the Code of Conduct talks about things like drinking and smoking, well, what happens when you go overseas and you're in a country like France where the drinking age is not 21, it's less than that? How do you handle that? You also want to talk to chaperones about what is their supervisory requirements. Are they going to be required to walk a hall, do bed checks, do lock checks? What do they do if they find a problem? What happens if they find someone drinking, for example, where it's prohibited? What happens if they find, let's say, on a senior trip, guys in the girls' rooms, girls in the boys' hotel rooms? How's that going to be handled? It's a good idea to put those requirements or those expectations in place.
The next step after that, after the chaperones and their supervisory responsibilities, if you don't want to go down that route totally, what a lot of our K-12 clients are doing is hiring security contractors, and that's what you want to get in place. If that's the route you're going to take, make sure you get that checked out ahead of time. You find the right contractor, you vet the contractor to make sure that they're reputable, and make sure you know when you want to use them and how you want to use them. Like I said, a lot of our K-12 clients are using that now. It takes a lot of responsibility off the teachers, the professors, and the chaperones.
And if you're doing that, it's a really good idea to find out from the security company, or let's say the hotel or the resort is going to provide security. It's a good idea to talk to them about what they will do if they find a violation. And it's also a good idea to tell them what you expect them to do. So, for example, if they say to you, if we identify or we find underage drinking, use of illegal substances or whatever, maybe let's say someone has a weapon on them, however you define that, if their response is we call law enforcement right away, well, then you need to know that because that's what the response is going to be. On the other hand, if you want them to notify you if certain things occur, if there's a complaint that there's a lot of noise, that's something they could probably handle on their own. But it's a good idea to find out what their expectations are, what they're going to do, and then it's a good idea to talk to them about what you're looking for also. Okay, just some things to think about during the trip. This first point is kind of important to us, and that's really to limit the amount of free time that students have while they're traveling. This is really kind of age appropriate. Certainly if you're dealing with college students, it's different than if you're dealing with let's say middle school or high school students. The reason we bring this up is one of the largest claims that we handled here at Wright occurred about 10 years ago, and it involved a varsity football squad that was away at the end of August for some training. The claim involved hazing, but it was really sexual assaults. The attacks were done during the day in the student housing, in the barracks, and occurred during the free time between drills, films, between meals, team meetings, and things like that. So if you're going to allow free time, which everyone does, not a bad idea to think about how you might want to take a walk in. You let students know that they have really not a lot of rights of privacy, that staff and supervisors, chaperones can walk in pretty much when they need to make sure that things are working and there isn't any problems. Good idea to provide telephone contact numbers, email addresses for everyone so they know to get in touch with each other. A recommended student-to-chaperone ratio is 10 to 1, probably more for middle school than, let's say, freshmen in high school. That's debatable, but not a bad way of starting. If you have a curfew, well, you need to enforce the curfew. I'll leave it up to you to decide how you're going to do bed checks. But if you have a curfew, you need to enforce it. That's one reason that I think a lot of our clients will work with an outside security firm or security through a hotel, because they kind of let them do that. And if there's violations that need to be reported, then they know who to report to. Plan for disruptions in schedule because of transportation issues or because of weather. You want emergency contact information distributed to everyone. And use social media. I mean, good idea to post on Facebook or whatever other way, you know, how things are going, where you are, how the event's occurring. This way, if there are parents that are not being contacted by their kids, they can go up there and kind of see where you are. Foreign travel presents enormous, great opportunities for everyone. I mean, going overseas and visiting some of the locations and sites that people have been studying about in their classrooms or in their courses is just great. However, you're a very long distance away. There are typically language issues, maybe customs issues, regulatory issues that present challenges. So some things to think about. More, again, on the K-12 level, are there any restrictions on travel? Are there some countries that the institution will not permit travel to? If so, good to know. Do parents support foreign travel? Usually, yes, but if there are events that are occurring that make them nervous, the answer might be no. Good to know that before you get going. We have some web resources at the end of this presentation. The U.S. State Department can be a big help. They can notify you if there are travel restrictions or warnings. There's opportunities to register your group with the U.S. consulate, with the foreign country, so they know where you are, how long you're going to be there for. We had a client a while ago where there was a lot of pressure on them to send a group off to, I forgot the country, I think it was in Latin America, South America. The school didn't want to do it. They found out that the U.S. State Department had travel warnings for that particular place, so they were able to kind of get around that. There's currently warnings for about 28 countries if you go on the site. The Centers for Disease Control have health information for U.S. travelers. There's also some recommendations on vaccinations and things like that. You want to check your immunizations for students and staff before they travel. And once again, as I mentioned before, if you're taking your code of conduct overseas, well, that means probably that staff and chaperones may not be able to drink. And as I mentioned before, if the drinking age is below 21, as it is in some European countries, well, what do you do now? So you have kids out on free time. They're walking down the street. There's a cafe. They technically can drink there. You don't allow it. How are you going to handle that?
I was just going to add on the flip side of that, if you have students coming in from a foreign country where you're hosting them, make sure, the main thing is to vet the host, whoever's going to be hosting that student or students, because that's where your liability could come into play if you're placing them into a bad situation. The other part of that is make sure that there's communication, that there's contact for that student coming in from a foreign country who may not speak the language. Make sure that they are perfectly comfortable having a couple of different contacts, that if they're lost, they need help, up into they're being abused and they have no idea who to talk to. So make sure that there's an outlet for that as well. Okay, so this last slide kind of presents some, I guess, questions, challenges, things to think about. What ifs? The student is arrested, if staff or chaperone is arrested, the airport closes down, not just for a few hours, if the bus breaks down, if a student is missing, doesn't report back, if a student is seriously ill or injured, if luggage is stolen, if there is civil unrest overseas, if
there's a utility failure in the location where you are. Good things to think about when you're putting your emergency management plan together. And the last page we have here is just some web links, some references that you might want to look into. Certainly, if you're going overseas, real good idea to check in with the U.S. State Department. You can also speak to them over the phone, and they'll answer questions, give you suggestions. Not uncommon for us to hear of a school or a college that contacted the State Department and said, no real problems with that particular country, but there are some areas in the country where, let's say, that the local law enforcement is not that good, they don't have coverage, there are some other issues, political issues, maybe the medical facilities are not that good in certain areas, so you might want to keep your kids out of there.
The most important part of that also is to remember, the last thing, if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact your agents, your brokers, contact us. There's plenty of resources, plenty of information out there on the web or through individuals that should be responsible for helping you.
Okay, thank you, Bob, and thank you, Andrew. We will now respond to any questions that you've submitted, and we'll give you a second to submit some. Guys, if you have any questions, please just type them into the chat button. We're going to give you a couple another second. Everyone, remember, you will get a copy of the presentation. You don't have to worry. At the end, there will be a follow-up email either today or tomorrow that you will receive, which will include the presentation that was given today and any of the policies that we discussed that maybe we would send to you, or if you have a question, if you would like a policy, maybe we can get that to you, as well as the recording of this webinar for anyone who missed it or if you know anybody that you'd like to send it to. Okay, on behalf of Wright Specialty and our speakers today, I want to thank you for participating. We will be holding monthly webinars on a variety of school-related topics, and we hope you will join us again. We also welcome any suggestions on topics for future webinars. Please send them to Matt Henderson at mhenderson@wrightinsurance.com. A replay of today's webinar, as well as a hard copy of the presentation, will be available under the news heading on our website at www.wrightspecialty.com. Thank you, guys, and have a pleasant day.